Hello and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2024 conference brings you this session, which is called Genre Alchemy, Creating a Tangible Atmosphere. And so we're going to be talking a lot about genres and how you create the feel for that genre. I'm your host, Tim McLaughlin, and I tend to write urban fantasy. And so I'm really hoping to hear from a wide variety of people. So let's meet our panelists. Leanna, go ahead.
Hi, I am Leanna Renee Hieber, and I write cross genre. The alchemy is definitely in what I do. I write both fiction and nonfiction. I tend to write historical fantasy, gaslamp fantasy to be specific, which is 19th century set fantasy with strong, diverse cast of characters coming together to save the day. And I also write nonfiction. And the through line in all of this is ghosts. So ghosts are in everything. So for me, the necessary genre component is the spirit world. So,
And Jacob, please.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Devlin. I have written 7 books. They're all fantasy, different kinds of fantasy. I've done dragon fantasy for middle grade readers. I also write a little bit for YA. My most recent book was Godfather Death MD, which is a twist on the Godfather Death story from the Brothers Grimm. So I do a lot of retellings, kind of trying to modernize things and experimenting with different genres in different ways. Godfather Death kind of works in different elements of other genres too that I'm excited to talk about. So just really excited to be here. So.
Awesome. And Amanda?
Hey everyone, I am Amanda B. Weaver, formerly Amanda Ross, and I write fantasy and horror. I have been writing since 2020. My most recent title, No One's Gonna Take Her Soul Away, came out April 30th. And that is a horror novel. But like I said, I write fantasy as well. And my through line is I tend to cover dark topics. So a whole lot of ghosts, very similar to Leanna, but also magic and witchcraft, vampires and werewolves are generally present in all of my books. And I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. And finally, Hing.
Hey everybody, I'm Hien Nguyen, and I am primarily a writer of speculative fiction broadly, so that's SFF, horror. I am also a ghost girly, and it tends to be on the literary spectrum. I'm a cross-genre writer, which, for better or worse, has colored all of my writing. I have a lot of short fiction published, and a lot of it is inspired by Vietnamese mythology. I am Vietnamese, and my upcoming YA debut is about Vietnamese ghost stories and definitely has the kind of undertone of family and intergenerational grief and all of that tied into the spooky stuff. So very excited to chat about atmosphere today.
Awesome. So let's start by kind of defining what is the role of the genre in defining the atmosphere? How does the genre kind of set what atmosphere you're going to be working with as you write?
there's expectations from the readers about where they find themselves as a reader. I find that um, I write a lot of Gothic inspired stories. And so for me, setting is character. And so that includes the atmosphere, the haunted place, obviously, with ghosts being at the fore of many of our work, setting as character and the haunted setting. Now that haunted setting can also be a spaceship. I have sort of psychic phenomena that I've done in some of my work that's actually time slip, where I have a character who goes from Iron Age Britain to Victorian England to a spaceship in the 23rd century. And she's slipping through different past lives kind of concurrently. And in each one of those, the setting and the atmosphere obviously is very different when you're on a starship. That is very much a very specific surrounding. So for people in sci-fi, where there's a space setting, that's something that we're very familiar with in terms of the visuals. There's a little bit of shorthand in things like that, and there's also shorthand in a spooky setting if it's a haunted place. So I think that there's every genre has a certain amount of those settings that are familiar, and then from those settings you have a sense of place in which the story is taking place. And how quickly you get to a dead body depends on if it's a mystery versus a fantasy versus, so the different, I think the different genre expectations then affect how you move through the setting and the place and the atmosphere that you've created.
I would agree with that. I think it's also a way for you to subvert expectations as well, because if you are writing, so, my novel, No One's Gonna Take Her Soul Away, my character is going through a world that looks a whole lot like hell. And so there's different layers, different areas that she's traveling to. And while there's a couple places that look very much like your stereotypical, fire and brimstone or, horrific things going on, there's also a couple places that look straight out of a cover spread of Vogue or whatever, like a Fiji island or something. So it's also an opportunity for you to say, hey, this is a beautiful place, but bad things happen here. I think there's a reason why, to bring in a movie that is really popular, why Midsommar is so popular is because the movie is set in a beautiful, sunny place, and yet some horrific things are happening. So I think while, readers will have that expectation, it's also a good opportunity to subvert those expectations.
I really like that point that you just made, Amanda. I think that some of my favorite stories have been the ones where there's a twist involved or like some sort of spin on what I was expecting. So like I heard a panel with V.E. Schwab once, and she was talking about how when she writes her settings, she starts with, what if this world was just like our world, except that, and then she'll like infuse some sort of element that twists things. And that's something that I've always really liked and tried to put some influence of that into my own writing, where it's like my books tend to start in our world or a world that feels really similar to where we're at. And then something will come in from kind of like the next dimension or from the fantasy world and kind of start spinning things. And so it's a really fun way to explore, kind of what if there's this other element out there? What's this unknown thing that's going to twist the setting or the direction of the plot? So.
For me, I think the conversation around setting and genre is really interesting. There are a lot of cross-genre writers in this group, it seems like. And so that in itself is a strength, but also a challenge. Others have said, readers have expectations. So for Gothic horror, there's a lot of detail, right? Setting is a character. And then for things like, a really traditional science fiction or fantasy book, there's a reader expectation of having a lot of detailed world building. But that may not be something the writer wants to do, right? Because the lack of information or lack of description also has a role. Juxtaposed to Gothic horror, like Eldritch horror, where the unknown is what's terrifying. And so if you're kind of writing between genres, at least I think understanding what the genre conventions are really important. And if you're going to subvert them or even blend them together, then you know what you're doing, right? And I will say as an author who's pursuing traditional publication, that will be something you will run into. Just know that genre blend work is not new. It's been around. There are plenty of writers doing it, but as a debut, typically the kind of restraints of genre I find are a little bit more stringent. So just prepare yourself for a little bit more of a challenge to kind of sell the fact that you are writing a book that is going to be across different genre conventions, and thus the way you treat setting is maybe not going to sit very cleanly in one bucket.
It's so true. That's exactly my journey. I am traditionally published, and for the longest time, editors kept telling me, I love your book, I don't know where to shelve it." And I still get that in my work. So now there is a genre called gaslamp fantasy that is very specific, but that didn't really exist in the early 2000s when I was starting to professionally query to traditional houses. And it took a smaller house that did mass market publications that was not afraid to do cross-genre work to kind of take a chance on a debut. And ever since then, I've been shelved in so many different places, even though I have crossover characters, and each one of those series has been set on a different shelf. So it really is. It really, really, really is a challenge. It's not something that I would necessarily recommend people to do unless this is the work that you have to, like, you are in fact just in your bones a cross genre writer, because it is really tough from a marketing perspective to find your people. You have to kind of find yourself doing double, triple duty and touching down with the mystery readers and the fantasy readers and the romance readers and the historical readers. That stuff can be, but at the same time, that is just who I am as a writer.
Yeah, I agree. It's just, I don't want to like have people watching this feel discouraged. Write what you want to write, but just be mentally prepared.
Now, there is a bit of a fine line between writing cross genre and just muddling genre, right? So how do you use kind of setting details and genre expectations and everything like that to stay on the right side of that line, to make sure that you are borrowing elements without causing confusion?
I mean, I think it's something that we've all kind of discussed, right? Which is knowing the genre conventions. I think it's kind of, you have to know those rules in order to break them, or in order to stretch them or create your new rule. So I think it's first and foremost doing that. It's making sure you're doing your research into those genres, consuming those genres in multiple mediums. And then I think it takes a little bit of plotting, even if you are a pantser. It takes a little bit of, I think, figuring out what rules you're going to play with, what the world is going to look like. So that way you can make sure that you're doing it properly, because I think that element is not necessarily something you can just go on with just vibes, maybe the rest of the story, but the genre setting you might need to be a little bit more tactical with.
Yeah, I think constraints, giving yourself a certain amount of like guardrails. For me, I have a realistic Victorian atmosphere in which paranormal things happen. So my guardrails are, this is in fact as much as I can know from my research, a realistic 19th century. I'm a New York City tour guide, so I set most of my stories are New York City set along the same streets that I walk, and I try to choose some buildings that are still there and some other things that I know are like really core and palpable, that give that a real lived in place. And then the sort of an element of secret history of like, well, this could have happened for people who can see ghosts. And and I have sensitivities to spirit world. So there's some of my own experiences with all of that go into all that. But I think that you don't want to necessarily bite off more than you can chew. I think that making sure that you're consistent about your world building and what constraints you set. Ghosts could be a very powerful tool, but you have to give them a constraint. You have to kind of give limitations within your world, and that's just the more detailed you can be with your world building, and then not break your own rules that you set out. That will keep you from breaking genre conventions as well.
I like that word that you mentioned, guardrails, Leanna, because I think that that's kind of an approach that I took with Godfather Death. And it was a tricky one to write, but at its core, it's a retelling of a fairy tale. And so I started thinking about, kind of that rule of three that tends to show up in fairy tales. That became sort of my format. And I divided the book into three parts. And you can see it when you're reading. Here's part one, here's part two, here's part three. So that was kind of something for me. And hopefully it works for the readers too, where like you can see like, here's where we're going to kind of start shifting gears a little bit. So part one feels very much like your standard like family drama, I guess. Like it starts very realistic. And then in part two, it kind of feels like this sitcom slowly unraveling and things start to feel a little bit more strange. And then by part three, it's kind of that full-blown fantasy. And there's that through line of fantasy through the whole entire book, but it's just kind of figuring out like, how can I use format to kind of make this a little bit more structured, even when I'm kind of bending some of the rules too.
Yeah, not to just be repeating, but I love the word of guardrails, and I think sorry, that's my cat. But atmosphere is made up of setting, character, narrative voice, what's happening with the plot, all of these different things, right? So if one of those things, as if you're writing genre blend or maybe kind of challenging genre conventions, making sure that when you're experimenting or maybe pushing genre in one aspect, the other ones still kind of fit the reader expectation, right? Because if all of them are not within reader expectation, then that may not be within the genre you're writing. And I think that reader expectation is important to have that when you establish that early on, have that be kind of the through line that you follow. An example I think of is post-apocalyptic novels, like Post-apocalypse is really critical to the plot, right? So dystopian, it matters how society has reformed itself for like the core conflict. And so it makes sense there that you need to have a lot of world building. But books like The the Book of M or Station 11, where the post-apocalypse is kind of like a setting for a different story to take place. I think in both those books early on, you get the expectation as a reader, like this isn't necessarily about the post-apocalypse, even though it is. So then readers are probably like, okay, well, I will know less about how the world has ended up this way. Versus a different book, you like, I need to know why the world is like this, because that's the whole point of this book. So staying true to what you're trying to do in your book, if that makes sense. And that will all kind of maybe be more apparent once you finish and have to revise.
So this is a panel about creating a tangible atmosphere and how genre plays into that. So let's kind of step into a big picture for a moment and just kind of describe or define what is atmosphere for a reader. What are we talking about when we're talking about the atmosphere of a story?
For me, it's as many sensory details as possible to really, really make this as alive for you. I think of atmosphere as being something that's immersive, something that you can see, hear, taste, smell, all of the above. And that's important for me too, from my other career as a performer. All of my training is actually as a professional actress, and I was just kind of writing in the background all through going out and touring nationally with mostly historical pieces. And that was really helpful for me writing historical fiction, because I knew what it felt like to run around a stage in a corset and, have all of these various tactile sensations about a world around me that I needed to make the audience believe that everything around me was London in the time of Dracula. And so the trying to bridge that gap between you as the creator and the audience there, whether it's as a performer or whether it's as a writer, as many details as possible. And so for me, wanting to be able to step into that both as a performer and also as a writer, that immersive quality, whatever immersive means to you. Some writers enjoy the visuals in their mind. Others don't actually have the visuals in their mind. I'm a very visual writer, but again, there's no wrong way to do this. But I think the more descriptive the world is possible without going so descriptive that your editor dings you for pacing. Story of my life.
I agree with all of that. And I think atmosphere can also be, for me, I like to implement a lot of fashion, a lot of culture in that way. I'm a Black author, I'm a Black queer author, so I implement those things in my books. And so, for example, my previous novel, In the House of Transcendence, was set in a culture that's very similar to ballroom. So the atmosphere was, it's set in Savannah, so you have the Spanish moss and the humidity and all of that, but you also have the different house conventions and you have the fashion and all of those statements there. And I think that helps to tell that story, because you feel like you're just maybe a fly on the wall as these people are going about their world. And in my novel, No One's Going to Take Her Soul Away, the beginning part of the novel is set in New York in 1979. So the atmosphere there is disco, it's decadence, it's gold, it's shimmering lights. And in each aspect of the hellscape my character goes through, I talk about what the air tastes like, what is the air feel like, how is it, is her hair getting frizzy from the humidity, all of that. And I think that helps to really make the reader feel like they're, like I said, a fly in the wall and very immersed in the world.
I can speak to this a little bit in terms of my writing, where I have the issue where I'm an underwriter. So things happen very fast and I don't tell you what's happening. So I have kind of the issue of like needing to beef up setting and needing to beef up my narrative. But I've been told that a lot of my work is atmospheric. And I think when you're getting into writing, atmospheric and voice are both very nebulous, but once you kind of write for a while, you know what it feels like, right? And so, like others have said, it's the five senses as well as emotion, feeling, but also thinking of that more in a more complex way than just like, oh, describing how something feel, touches, or how they, because the lack of that, right? If a character is maybe describing things in a very sterile way, if they're not describing things, if there are things you would think they would pay attention to given the plot and the context and they're not, like what does that say? So all of that creates an atmosphere. And you know, it's for me, I know it's like not really that helpful advice, but kind of going with your gut. So if you're going back and revising things and trying to make things maybe more descriptive or less descriptive, it feels incorrect. If it feels like as you're reading that, like this isn't quite right, trust that, because I think atmosphere comes through when the authorial intent kind of matches the story being told. And so for me, it's been, you know, I do need to challenge my underwriting tendencies, but at the same time realizing like, okay, I could add a bunch of description to this, but it actually is serving to distract because it's not actually telling the story I want to tell. So I think that's a big part of figuring out atmosphere for yourself as well. Because a book, you know, two different books, one that has a lot of description and one that has very minimal description, both have atmosphere. They're just different.
Yeah, and I also think about just the overall vibe that can come through too. And listening to you, I was thinking a lot about like the Lord of the Rings, and like J.R. Tolkien is, we talk a lot about how he can talk about a tree for hours, right? And he's really great about infusing those five senses and providing a lot of really great detail about his world. But I also really love the thing that I love about those stories is how, one moment is very lighthearted and, you're with the hobbits and you're, kind of getting that sense of joy and everything. And then, but in that same story, you could also get that sense of dread and that sense of, the weight of the ring and kind of how it influences the world around them and everything. And so just thinking about like, what's that overall feeling that comes through and that tone and kind of that lingering emotion that readers are left with when they close the book, whether it's after the end of the chapter or the end of the book, like what's that feeling that they're still carrying with them. That's kind of one way that I think about atmosphere.
And just to add, it's important for fiction and nonfiction too. So I write fiction and nonfiction, both of this, especially with narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is a term that's kind of meant to separate it from like academic nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction is the stuff that they want to sort of be accessible to a broad demographic. And so with A Haunted History of Invisible Women, which is the book that's featured here, that's nonfiction. Wanting to give you a sense of the place in which these women haunt, we had to do a lot of different settings. We had to kind of give you the reader a sense of place, just like we would in fiction, because each one of these places that the ghosts that we were describing haunt is a very, very specific historical place with its own context, and each one is very different. And so needing to set the scene every single chapter, that is very important no matter what kind of fiction or nonfiction, or no matter what kind of writing that you do. A sense of atmosphere and place and how to evoke it is critical to think about, whether you do overwrite or underwrite it. Having a sense of how you've crafted the world of what you're talking about is, I think, one of the biggest skills as a writer. And I'm still figuring it out as I go to, from one project to the next.
So there was a lot of talk in there about, increasing the sensory awareness of the scene, and that atmosphere revolves around that a lot. But there was a clear distinction made between description and atmosphere. So how do different genres kind of inform not only word choice, but word depth, like number of words, in order to create the right atmosphere? Are there genres that lean towards being more or less wordy, and what are some examples of that?
One of the reasons I write historical fiction is because I can be more wordy. People expect historical fiction to be verbose. I love 19th century syntax, but that does not mean that I can get away with a Henry James paragraph. Like I can't, the density of a lot of Victorian writers. My favorite rejection from a publisher who is now my publisher, Kensington Books, way back in the day was I was querying My Strange and Beautiful saga set in 1888 London, and they were like, it's a little too Victorian. I was like, thanks. It's set in 1888, but they meant that the pacing was too slow and that the language starting out was too dense. And so it's not that I had to dumb it down at all. It's just that I had to thin it and create a balance between Victorian language and our modern. So I split the difference between a Victorian tone and a casual everyday modern tone. So I went to the genre that I could get away with the most words in.
So I'll speak to my experience as a genre blend, but that like literary genre blend, which for me, it's one of those things that's very nebulous and squishy, but the expectation for most readers is that they may not primarily be genre readers. They may be more so literary readers, and there's an allowance of less words, right? That you tell less to the reader. So that's definitely true of, I think, those genre blend books. And I think examples to think about for me that I've recently read and loved. What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher is a gothic story. There's a lot of detail. It's very sensory. It's very eerie, and you just kind of like feel it as you're reading. And a book I read that's also technically a horror. It's Monstrilio, and I forget the author's name. But it's a horror that is. It is a horror, but it's primarily a story of grief. So a mother whose son dies. She takes a piece of his lung and it grows into this kind of monster that she raises to be a stand-in for her son. And so there's a monster there, but the atmosphere created, because there's not a lot of really in-depth detail about the setting, because that's not the focus. It's really the characters. And so despite the fact these are both horrors, they do them differently. And Monstrilio is definitely one that kind of falls into that genre blend literary camp a little bit more. And so knowing that, I think in terms of my own writing has been important. I do, I love fantasy. So I do want to challenge myself. Like one day I'll write that epic fantasy that has like a lot of detail. And for me, and I think a good piece of advice I've gotten is to take a piece of writing you really like or enjoy the atmosphere, like just like a paragraph, and like really like study it, right? Do the sentence diagramming, paragraph diagramming, like what makes this paragraph so good for this particular story, and even try to like replicate it, right? Like if I were to try to take this structure and put my own words, what would that look like? And I think that would at least help me learn a lot while also retaining my kind of voice. And so I think a lot of my learning as a writer has been like, there's this like intangible thing I like about these books, and I can't actually tell you why. And it takes that kind of considered effort to realize, okay, I still can't really describe it, but I have an intuition about why this works for this book and maybe not for another.
I like that. Oh, sorry, go for it.
I was just gonna say I looked it up. It looks like it's Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova.
Sounds interesting. I like that advice that you gave about kind of analyzing that scene or seeing like, how could I rewrite this in my style there? Because there's a book that I heard about. I'm wondering if any of you know what it is, because I forget the title, but I heard about it on a podcast at some point. And I feel like it might have been released in French first, but it's like 40 versions of the same scene over and over again, but like told in different tones and different word choices. And I just thought it sounded really fascinating, but I just completely forgot what it's called. And I'm really interested in studying that one day. It's like the same scene, just told in 40 different ways. So
Yeah, I think for me, it just depends on kind of the genre and the type. So, an example in the House of Transcendence is more of a contemporary fantasy. So, it is by its nature a little bit shorter because, yes, I'm describing Savannah. Yes, I'm describing that atmosphere, but it's also a place that people can access, they know. So, therefore, I didn't feel like I needed to go into as much world building in terms of the setting as I did in No One's Gonna Take Her Soul Away, which is largely told in this completely different unknown hell. And I'm going through every single island of this hell. And so therefore each island has its own vegetation, its own climate, its own type of torture. So I'm describing that more. And I think it just depends on what your goal is and what role the setting plays. Is it a character? Is it not a character? Is it your background? I think that can dictate both atmosphere and then also the amount of words that you use to describe it. And I think in terms of description and word choice and all of that, I think that also comes down to your own individual style, which I feel like when you're, a genre hopping author, as all of us are, I think we all end up having our own style that's so unique to us. And I think that that's really wonderful. And so I think that, you could give each of us that same paragraph to dissect, and we could all maybe have a completely different answer as to why we like it, and try to write it ourselves, and it would be completely different. So I think that also plays a role too.
Now, as you're playing with genre expectations, obviously this means that you're using shorthand that people are expecting and used to. How do you avoid it feeling cliched or, just copy pasted or anything like that?
For me, it's the closer you know your characters, no one else is going to be those people. We are all, each one of us, so unique. And just has been said, like we could each be given the same prompt and write a completely different story. And so I think that is where being familiar with your genre, yes, but at a certain point, step away from reading your genre. I have to kind of do a delineation where I'll just read nonfiction that's corollary, because I just don't want stuff to sort of bleed over just by osmosis, because I love intake. And I don't want to unconsciously be copying another person's style. So I think that like really leaning into the things that you love, that are your favorite things in the world. And I mean, that's how my first book got started. I put all of my favorite things into one book, and this was my blender, and and out came Strange Beautiful. But the sort of staying true to yourself, which has also been great advice here, staying true to your own style, what feels good, trusting your gut on that too, and then really, really, really getting to know your characters. Now, I say this as a character-driven novelist who is an actor, so of course I'm going to be a character-driven person. I'm going to see through the eyes of the character. But the more that you invest in really kind of walking in their shoes, seeing with their eyes, that is going to translate onto the page in a truly unique capacity. The more that you kind of give over to them in that regard. And I do just think that human beings are really interesting and diverse. And make sure that your world is also like that. You as a person are learning diversely, and have lots of diverse voices around you in your world, so that you don't end up sounding just like the same. Nothing in this world is homogenous. So I feel that like the more wide of a range that you can be experiential with, the more that's going to factor into a really, really rich vocabulary, both in terms of your words, but also your experiences.
Yeah, I like the advice of kind of starting with character, because with Godfather Death, like there were a lot of tropes from fairy tales that I played with, but also tropes from different other genres. I talked about how family drama is kind of the start of the book. And so I pulled in, like your stereotypical like Thanksgiving dinner where everything kind of goes wrong, right? But for those scenes, I really tried to think of it from the lens of my main character, who is carrying some really intense grief, and kind of like, what do I want to say about grief with this book? And so it's kind of like what we were talking about with, like each of us could write a paragraph, like the same scene in different ways, right? So with this book, I tried to think about like some of the conventions of the genre, and then think about it from the lens of this character and his relationship with Death, who has kind of been personified as a doctor in this world, and it's his godfather, right? So kind of thinking about like the relationship between these two, and like how do they experience these things around them. So
I think it's also honestly about having fun, right? I think your readers are gonna know. So, no one's gonna take your soul away. I describe it as kind of being inspired and kind of a mashup between Dante's Inferno and The Wiz / Wizard of Oz. It's like if they came together and had a love child. That's shorthand. People who are familiar with those works can think, okay, I have an idea of what to expect. But then I think it's about taking those cliches and saying, okay, like I'm gonna write a slasher, right? We all kind of know what the conventions of a slasher are, but then how can you do it in your voice and understand and have confidence in the fact that even if you take something that at this point is, we know what to expect, like a slasher, you're still going to do it in your own unique voice, in your own unique way. And maybe you bring in your own personal experience. You bring in, I'm going to do a slasher, but I want it to be, inspired by Rosemary's Baby. I don't know how they would go together, but you understand what I mean, right? Like playing with those different conventions and having fun, and understanding that even if you take something that's a trope or kind of cliche by now, that you can do it in your own unique way and having fun. I think that that's kind of the best way to go about it, because if it's shorthand and it helps people recognize and want to read your book, why not play with that?
Yeah, I think Amanda's point on having fun is super important. And I would even say that if you're already mindful about cliches, you're already a step ahead of someone who's not thinking about cliches at all. And that's going to come through your writing in the first place. And then secondarily, that's something to really kind of drill down and revision. As you're drafting, have fun, write the book you want to write. It may be cliched and that's fine. And you can always go back and fix it. But I think if you're getting stuck on, oh, I don't want it to be cliche during drafting, you're going to maybe limit yourself in a way that makes it less fun for you and maybe makes for a less fun story or book as well. And I'll put another example here of a book, I think. So it's called Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukovka, and it's at its core a crime novel, right? You are following very much procedural at some points in the narrative, but at the beginning, you know who the killer already is, right? And so there's a kind of a subversion already built in there, and the focus is most definitely on like the victims of the violence. And so, you can take things that have a formula that readers understand and know and are a great shorthand and do your own thing with it. So I would say, again, back to our earlier points, readers have expectations and that's perfectly fine. And if you're mindful about that and mindful of how you're kind of breaking that, then that's going to come through your writing.
I should have asked this earlier. I think it would have more naturally flowed earlier, but I'll just ask now. Why is atmosphere important, and how does it kind of set your readers' expectations for what they're getting into?
I think because it is not a visual medium, you are creating the visuals with the atmosphere that you're writing. I love film and I love television, but I love writing novels more. There was a period of my life where I was like, maybe I want to try screenwriting. I want to lushly be in every last detail of setting that atmosphere. It's my favorite part of writing, is creating that atmosphere, because you get to be God and you get to do all the elements. I give a workshop sometimes called Direct Your Novel, Theatrical Techniques to writing your book, and talk about how you kind of have to be the director, the cinematographer, the lighting designer. You are every aspect of a film production. You're creating the film for the reader's mind's eye. And the more elements that you can be thinking of in that capacity as you're setting the scene in the beginnings of your book, and striking that right balance between describing the world and the inciting incident that gets people hooked into the storyline, that's a delicate balance that's forever hard for me to grasp. But once I figure out, okay, this is where we're starting and this is how we're starting and this is how we're going to make readers care about where we're going, but also giving them a sense of where they are, that books have to create atmosphere because we just have the words, and we need to that's the platform by which we engage with those readers and their imaginations.
I've been doing a little bit of experimentation with video game writing as like a side fun thing. And it's funny because as I've tried to study that, and it's the total opposite of being a novelist, right? All the advice, if you're a novelist, throw that out the window, because you have like the visual media, you have the sound design, all of that will like color that experience of someone playing the video game. So the writing has to be quite minimal and very to the point. And like Leanna was saying, for a book or for our story, you don't have that. Like it's all, the whole point is the reading. And so atmosphere is so important, because if I would imagine, I don't know, if you try to write a paragraph that's all declarative statements like, this is Bob, he goes to the store, he's a mailman, there's no atmosphere there. And so you wouldn't feel invested in that story. And for me, and I think is the beauty of books, is that you want to be immersed in that world. You want to be there and feel it, and feel the pain and stress and joy, right? And you can't do that if the atmosphere isn't conducive to that. So, it's hard, but it's something that develops, I think, as you write more and more and figure out like, okay, how do I specifically create atmosphere? And like that's Amanda mentioned before, we all do it differently.
Yeah, I think that you made some good points, especially when you were talking about being simplistic. Bob went to the store, whatever, right? Having a right atmosphere takes that sentence. Bob goes to the store from just a Bob goes to the store to Bob goes to the store and it's on fire. Bob goes to the store and he meets the love of his life. Bob goes to the store and it's covered in vines because now there's this alien invasion that has made the atmosphere hard to breathe. And so I think it helps to dictate what type of story that you're telling. It helps to take some simple details from a simple sentence to the max. And I think especially in horror, it helps to get your readers in that tense place right off the bat. And it can keep them there as you're moving them along the story, whether it's a slow burn kind of gothic horror or whether it is something that's like a slasher, or whether it's something like The Exorcist, right? By like William Peter Blatty. How wonderful of a book that is in the atmosphere and the slow tension. And half the time we're just following them around as they're going to Georgetown, but you can feel that creeping sense of dread. And that's partially because of the atmosphere that he splits between the banal mother-daughter life, and then also this creeping possession that's about to happen.
Yeah, and coming back to the example of, I mentioned V.E. Schwab earlier, and one of my favorite books or series that she's written is the Darker Shade of Magic series, where there's 4 versions of London, and they all have their own settings and their own atmospheres, and through these different atmospheres, it establishes stakes for what could really happen by the end of this, and it's all told through the lens of really 2 different characters who are kind of traveling between the Londons and kind of their relationship with, this really dark magic, and then this place where there's no magic and there's just different stakes in each one. And so you can kind of see, what's at stake for the novel as a whole, seeing these characters go through 4 very different versions of the same world.
Yes, that brings us to something that we've already started to touch on, examples. But I want to lean into that a little bit more and just give us, if you could, some examples of books that have really great atmospheres, that do a really good job of setting atmosphere and making it tangible. And what did you learn about atmosphere from those works?
Well, classically, I have to say, like, Dracula really informed a lot of things for me because Stoker's writing from a lot of different perspectives, because it is an epistolary novel. So you have things written from a newspaper article, you have diary entries, you have all of these different sources by which we learn of the horror. And I just thought, and when I was a kid, cutting my teeth really on the Victorian classics, I just thought that was just really cool. And I liked that different point of view approach, and that was really rich and lush in that regard. And to me, it also gave a sense of like a detective compiling evidence too. And I really love that. I will always go back to that as something that's super, super formative for me. But in terms of like modern gothics, I mean, I love Shirley Jackson. The Haunting of Hill House, the opening paragraph that was really beautifully illustrated in Mike Flanagan's adaptation for Netflix, like that, how atmospheric all of that was. This entity, this house that is quite a character. That's such a great. It's such a great example. And there are so many really, really great modern Gothic writers. Sylvia Moreno Garcia just does incredible things in Mexican Gothic, recreating the traditional Gothic, but as a Latina author, she's bringing a lot of other cultural importance into this too, and she's using all of these lush Gothic tropes and just doing it in a different way. The Hacienda by Isabel Canas, same thing. She's doing really beautiful reimaginings of the Gothic. Victor Laval is doing incredible things. He was, reimagining cosmic horror with The Ballad of Black Tom. And there's just lots of great, and you see that also happening in film where filmmakers like Jordan Peele are reimagining classics and doing it in a way that's more inclusive and more diverse, which I love to see. And there's just so many. There's too many names to mention, which is a great problem to have. So please tell me other names.
I think some other authors who I feel like are really good with their atmosphere. This author's name is Yaya Schofield, and their book is On Sunday She Picked Flowers. And it's gothic. It reads like a gothic fairy tale, but also one that you know is going to go very wrong from the very first paragraph. And I think that the forest and the house that this character ends up in is they're both haunted and are characters of their own. I think that that's a wonderful wonderful book. I would say from a fantasy standpoint, a really great book that does good atmosphere is We Are the Origin by C.M. Lockhart. This does a really good job with the world building, and there's, I believe, 4 or 5 different realms, and each realm is completely different. One has technology, one is very rural, and another one is like sun scorched, and the people are, constant, like they live in a desert kind of atmosphere. And I think it just does a really good job of giving you that sense of place as the main character moves through all of these different areas. Without confusing the reader, without having to over explain or under explain. So I would say those are 2 really great examples, in addition to the one I mentioned, which of course is The Exorcist. I mean, that's a really great example of horror that gives you that slow burn and escalating terror. And then once you're in that terror place, you kind of don't get to leave until you close the book.
Hing, you've mentioned I think 3 or 4 books so far that you said did a really good job. How did they impact your writing? How did they kind of teach you about atmosphere?
Sure. So, a lot of the titles I have listed so far are kind of that speculative literary genre blend, right? And so that's where I write, and it definitely informs my writing in the sense that there is a lot of attention to the line level prose, right? The lyric, but all of that is also still in service to atmosphere. So a very simplistic, and I know there's some contention over this, but to understand literary writing versus genre writing is like literary writing pays attention to the word, and for, more traditional genre, you don't not pay attention to the word, but it should not come at the expense of like plots or genre conventions, right? And so when you blend those 2 together, you have to kind of do both, where there's an attention to line level prose. And I think for all those books, what the line level prose does, and the attention to like, okay, I'm going to spend more time using a metaphor instead of just saying the thing, it does something, right? It makes you feel something that just describing the thing wouldn't necessarily have the same impact. And so I think that's, not just literary. I have issue with these genre conventions, but they're there in the first place. And a couple of other books I think do that. There's Ling Hun by Ai Jiang, which is a horror. It is speculative. It's a little bit trippy. You should just look it up. But it's a great book that I think there is atmosphere there. But so much of it is kind of just because you're in the head of the characters, and not a lot is necessarily described in the amount of detail other horror books might go into, but you still feel the atmosphere. Some other writers I think I read recently that do a really good job. I'm going to shout out a bunch of Vietnamese writers, but She Is a Haunting, which is a YA novel by Trang Thanh Tran, and then it's either Build My House Around My Body or Build the House Around My Body by Violet Krugersmith, which is another Vietnamese author. And they both deal with like the colonial history of Vietnam through kind of this speculative horror lens. And I just think they do it so well. And so much of horror is involved with these really kind of complex histories, and it comes through the writing. And, I think there's a lot of room to play with that from setting, character, etc. Right?
Yeah, I think V.E. Schwab was definitely a big one for me. Just, kind of what I mentioned earlier about like, what if this world was just like our world, except that, and trying to think of that one thing. And I feel like Neil Gaiman also does a really great job of that in anything that I've read from him. The Graveyard book comes to mind as one of my favorites from him, because that is a middle grade book that deals with some really kind of heavy stuff. And there's this heavy atmosphere in the Graveyard book too. I mean, it takes place in a graveyard the whole time, but it's like, but it's done so well because, it's accessible to, kind of different audiences and, across different age levels. And there's oddly kind of a sense of comfort that you can get from it too. Even though it kind of has that Gothic feel and that, kind of the heavy things that it deals with too. I reread that several times, and I reread the E. Schwab's books a lot too, because there's different layers that you can get from, the first time I'm kind of racing through the story, just wanting to know what happens next, and then if you go back and read it again, you can really pay attention to the words and the foreshadowing and just kind of the ways that she crafts the atmosphere. And I've just always been really fascinated by that, all the different layers that she puts into her work. So
we want to start wrapping up here. So just kind of last thoughts. What other things do you think viewers need to know about creating an atmosphere and connecting that with the genre that they're writing? What are some other bits of advice you might have for writers?
I'm an experiential person, so whenever I have a setting that I want to be writing about, if it exists in this world and I can safely access it, I will try to go visit it, because I just think there's something about how we process places that we're in versus what we're just researching online. And again, it was very hard writing nonfiction during the pandemic because there was only so many places I was able to even get into when we were working with this. And there were, over the course of my career, I've certainly had to be writing about places I couldn't actually go visit myself, but then, just have to definitely do your due diligence. But there is something about the atmosphere of a place that you have seen and felt yourself. Or if you're writing a secondary world, great. What is it like? And then going to immerse yourself in a place like, okay, well, this temperate zone is like the setting and the climate of where I've set my book. Trying to just feel that. And so that you get those sensory details, immersing yourself in an atmosphere that you can then kind of take notes about and translate into your work. I just think there's something that you can't, the experience of it is something that will translate palpably, I think, into your work, because you'll have sensory details that it wouldn't have occurred to you to put in unless you were in an environment that's comparable.
And to echo that, Amanda, when you're talking about writing based in Savannah, Georgia, I attended a writer's retreat, which I think you'd love, based out of Ossabaw Island, which is off the coast of Georgia. And being in the place does so much, right? That you feel things that you wouldn't necessarily feel by just like trying to Google it. And again, that is, not something everybody can do, but if you have the opportunity, I definitely recommend it. I think the other thing outside of going to a place is not, I know I feel like I'm giving a lot of homework, but like taking similar scenes or similar things across media, and it doesn't have to be just books, it can be film. My favorite kind of funny example is like the meadow scene in Twilight and then the meadow scene in Midsummer. Like they're both in meadows, it's really bright, right? But they do entirely different things. So like consume media like that, compare, write notes down, like what is different about these things that are based in the same kind of general setting, right? And the vice versa, right? They're based in entirely different settings, but they do the same thing. And that's been, I don't know, I think my friends will complain that I'm like, why can't you just watch something? I'm like, you know what? I try, but sometimes it's hard. So as a writer, you'll develop that part of your brain where you're just like always kind of like analyzing things. And, that will help a lot with creating your own atmosphere in your work.
I totally agree. And actually, so I lived in Georgia for a while. Savannah is one of my favorite places in this entire country. So I think that it's traveling as you can, to everybody's point, and experimenting and just going with a sense of curiosity and not necessarily going, oh, I'm going to go just to write a book, but going with a sense of curiosity wherever you go, even if it's somewhere in your own hometown. Maybe you've never visited it before, but I think it can spark that inspiration. I think more than that, it's pushing past your own fear, pushing past your own emotions to really go there, especially if you're writing horror or something in a secondary world that doesn't exist, inherently. I think it's really pushing past all of that can really help you create a good atmosphere, and asking yourself questions, the what if this happens, what if that happens, and kind of taking that down all of the different levels. What if this person's sitting in a park? What if there's an earthquake? What if they fall down the cracks of the earth, what happens, what's under the earth. I think that can really help you develop that atmosphere and then cultivate a really great story. And I think if you're telling something that's a little more historical, right? So a good example of this is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I think it's really, again, pushing past your own your own emotions and your own fear, and then doing all of that research and talking to other people who maybe have lived in that situation or lived at that time. Because I think research isn't just online or you going, it's also that interview type research that she did in that book, and that's why I think it's such a great book.
Yeah, I love and echo all of these suggestions. And I just thought about, I finished a book today called Life in Five Senses by Gretchen Rubin. And there were some really great suggestions that she had there too, where she did an experiment where she started visiting the Met every day. She lives in New York. And so she would go to the Museum of Art every day. And by the end, she thought she was going to get bored with it, but she just started noticing more and more like new things and really trying to engage with her senses, like seeing things in a different way, paying attention to different smells that she, wasn't being very mindful of before, and how that kind of bled into the rest of her life. She started to appreciate things at home more often. She started to connect different, like when she would taste something, she would connect it to memories of her childhood. And it really kind of heightened my appreciation for everyday things. And it's something that I might try too, pick a place that you go to every day, start visiting it and thinking about it through the lens of these five senses and seeing what are the new things you pick up. Like I work at the University of Arizona for my day job, and I've been there for years and years and years. But when I started thinking about this, I was walking around campus and there's this unicorn statue that we have on campus. And I never really thought about it before, but when I started paying attention to these things and being mindful of it, I was like, why, like what's the story behind this and why is that there? And sometimes that what if question that y'all brought up earlier, like that can spark so many different ideas and take your writing to different levels too.
I just want to add one example, a recent example that I think is one of the best in terms of a television show of creating many different kinds of atmosphere over the course of the season. And that's the season 4 of True Detective. I had not seen the other seasons of True Detective, but I kept hearing from all these writers I respect, like how good season 4 was. And Issa Lopez, as a showrunner, she just did an incredible job of creating radically different environments in which you are petrified about what is going to happen. And I don't want to give anything away, but it was such a clarion example of so many different types of settings and characters, from a brutal outside world to a brutal inside world, and in each case the atmosphere was just so palpable. And just from the use of sound, from the use of the lighting, from just the staging of everything, it was just holistically one of the most atmospheric seasons of television I've ever seen. So that's just my I keep thinking about it. Like I just keep thinking about it. And I think that's always a sign of good art for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. This has been very insightful. I hope the conversation is going great in Discord. So I'm just going to go ahead and let you guys introduce yourselves again. Tell us who you are, what you write, and where we can find you online. I am, again, your host, Tim McLaughlin. You can find me at TE McLaughlin, spelled just like that, .weebly.com. But let's see where the rest of you are. Leanna.
My fullname.com will give you an insight into each one of my different series. And I also write some speculative fiction for everand.com. So you can find novellas that span a whole different range of genres, and audiobooks that I've also narrated over there. So again, wherever books are sold, whether fiction or nonfiction, I have a page on my website that says where to start with Leanna's books. And it just gives you a sense of like, all right, well, if you like this, you'll like this series. In terms of what I feel and have been told is my most atmospheric, if you're just to for this, for the sake of this panel, My Strange and Beautiful Saga is probably my most atmospheric fiction. But we really do, with our nonfiction, with A Haunted History of Invisible Women, we do try to kind of give you some eerie food for thought and some interesting different atmospheres that you get to, haunted atmospheres to enjoy in our nonfiction too.
Awesome. And Jacob?
You can find me at authorjakedevlin.com, where I'm also on Instagram, Jacob Devlin Creates. And I'd like to think I have a little something for anybody, depending on your kind of age range, your interest in the fantasy realm. If you're a dragon person, I have Roses in the Dragon's Den. That's been one of my most popular. I have a fairy tale retelling trilogy called The Carver for more of a YA audience. I have an LGBTQ themed Halloween story that's been really fun for readers. And then Godfather Death, I would say, is probably my most atmospheric. It's probably my darkest, but I have kind of a full spectrum. If you want something kind of fun, family friendly, lighthearted, I have that too. So it's just kind of a pick your flavor sort of thing.
Awesome. Amanda?
Yeah, you can find me across socials at Amanda B. Weaver, being goofy on the internet and talking about all kinds of fiction. In the House of Transcendence is dark fantasy. There's a necromancer, there's witchcraft. I think you'll really like it, especially if you like reading books like that around Halloween time. I think also No One's Gonna Take Her Soul Away, which is my most recent title, is perfect for people who like horror, but I think it's also perfect for people who want to follow a character-driven horror story. Like I said, it's giving Dante's Inferno and The Wiz, Wizard of Oz. So I think you really enjoy that. And I also have a podcast, Horror Ho Support Group, where we talk about books. It's a podcast and book club. So you can find the details on Amanda B. Weaver, like I said, Instagram, TikTok, and X.
And Hien?
I write generally in the speculative space, but I do have a creative nonfiction piece published. I am everywhere as author Hien. On all the social medias, I am much more active on some versus others, but if it exists, you can probably find me there. And my website is also www.authorhien.com. All of my pieces you can read now are short fiction. So if you're looking for like a little bite-sized piece of fiction to read, I think that my longest story is like 1,400 words. I joke that I either write like flash fiction or novels, and I have a hard time in between. And I think that has to do with atmosphere, actually. Like you can build a lot with a novel, and then for short fiction, you have to like strip a lot away. My debut YA horror novel comes out next year with Delacorte. It is about Vietnamese American twins who are separated, and they reunite to investigate their mother's murder in a town plagued by drowned ghosts. It's being pitched as The Haunting of Bly Manor meets The Parent Trap. So not available yet. You can add it to Goodreads and Storygraph. But yeah.
So again, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists for this great discussion. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of WriteHive 2024. Have a great day.